Welcome, everyone. York University recognizes that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tikaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulette. Christine, will you walk us through the structure of the workshop? Is Christine still here?
Yeah, I'm still here. Thanks. Yeah, I'll go over just some housekeeping pieces to start with. It's great to see everybody's face. So if you can, please do turn on your camera. Absolutely no pressure if that's not available to you right now. We do ask that you mute your microphone if you're not speaking. It helps everybody's attention. And if that's a problem, we can also help that on the back end as well. We do recommend that you close unnecessary windows and tabs. It helps maintain both better internet connectivity as well as focus. And there might be some Zoom functions that we ask you to engage with today. And if that's the case, we'll also walk you through that. And my role is going to be similar to last session, to support, not take up more space than that. I'll try and manage chat while either Lisa or Professor Davis are speaking. And I can also try and support with any logistical issues you might have and share relevant resources, that kind of thing. For me, it continues to remain important to not center my white privilege in a discussion like this. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Professor Davis. I do also, sorry, with that, it's possible I might have to leave early today, in which case I do want to say thank you all for coming and engaging in this. And I am sorry for that. Would you like me to walk through the actual agenda?
Why don't you do that?
Sorry?
You can go ahead and do that, Christine.
Sure. So just to give people a little lay of the land before we start, the first part today, introduction, that's where we're right now, acknowledging the contributions of Black peoples in Canada and the university, and finding ways for recourse on the issues of anti-Black racism. And again, similar to last session, the second part, we're going to really look at what that means and how to think through actualizing making that kind of stuff happen. So a lot of participation will be asked of you there. Okay, thank you very much. And now I will pass over to Professor Davis. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Christine. We have the pleasure today of having our dean with us again. I am so grateful for that he has joined us on both of these sessions, made time in his extraordinarily busy calendar to demonstrate for all of us the commitment of the faculty and his own commitment to these conversations that we're having. I'm going to call on him now just to say good morning for those of you who haven't heard his voice yet. JJ?
Thank you so much, Andrea. And I helpfully put my title in my name, so apologies. I hope most of you have heard my voice before, and even recently as yesterday. I don't want to take up a lot of time, but I do really want to say a couple of things. First of all, a huge thank you to Andrea and the advisory team for all the work that they're doing. It is so important and so crucial, and they are doing a fantastic job at it, so thank you. Thank you also to the center for providing support for this event. And most importantly, thank all of you for coming here. We're at 104 people, or if you minus me, 103, which is really good. And these sessions are really, really crucial to our functioning and our moving forward as a faculty on the issue of anti-Black racism. And I really, I'm gonna try and stay today. I can't control my phone, but I'm gonna try and stay for all of it. But I really want to say to all of you how important it is that we do this work and do it together with seriousness and intention. And that it's really important that we remember as I committed, and I believe all of the faculty committed alongside of me, that we are going to work through these issues together, perhaps not as fast as we would like in some instances, but with consistency, fortitude, and forward-lookingness. Because while we're focused on this, at least for this year, this is not something that I at least want to walk away from. And so while we engage in these conversations, and they are difficult sometimes, and they require reflection, I want us all to remember the pathway that we've committed to make a really serious and structural change. And so with that sort of mini reflection, I want to say thank you again, and thank you for taking the time and taking this seriously.
Thank you, JJ, so much. So I have the responsibility this morning to do the first half of the presentation, which is to acknowledge the contributions of Black people in Canada and the university. And I want to offer a brief survey of Black presence in Canada, and then contextualize it by closing with some reflections on the role of the university. Many Canadians are actually unaware of the long history of Black communities in Canada, and often assume that Black people arrived here, like other racialized groups, primarily as immigrants after the 1960s. The history of Black communities in Canada, however, actually encompasses a 400-year period, beginning with the arrival of Matthew da Costa, sometime between 1603 and 1608, and then the first enslaved person, Olivier Lejeune, in 1630. Chattel slavery as a legal institution was created in Canada between 1689 and 1709, and would not be abolished until 1833. People of African descent in that 400-year period, in the 400-year period since their arrival, have established communities across Canada, from Nova Scotia to British Columbia, both as enslaved peoples, but also as free peoples. So 3,000 Black loyalists, for example, settled in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick between 1783 and 1785. While these were formerly enslaved workers, they abandoned plantations in the US South, chose to fight on the side of the British during the American Revolution, and then were resettled in Canada afterwards. The Black loyalists made an enormous contribution to the British war effort, as well as to the formation, the defense, and development of the early British colony that would become Canada. Another 600 Jamaican Maroons, a lot of people don't know this, arrived in Nova Scotia in 1796, and these were descendants of formerly enslaved people who escaped and set up autonomous communities. And when they became too difficult for the British to manage, they were deported essentially out of Jamaica and relocated in Nova Scotia. Almost 4,000 Black refugees also entered that province after the War of 1812. This complex demographic of Black communities in the Maritimes meant that both enslaved and free Black people who had fought to defend the rights and liberties of Great Britain and its North American colony lived and worked side by side, free and enslaved Black people living and working side by side in the 18th and 19th centuries. The presence of these various groups led to the establishment of many Black communities that still survive today. The history of Black presence before the 1960s that most Canadians know, however, relates to the 50,000 enslaved people who escaped into southwestern Ontario via the Underground Railroad between 1815 and 1860. And these newly arriving Black people also established communities. Camille Turner, who is a York PhD student, exposes the history of African enslavement in Toronto specifically, and the narrative of the Underground Railroad through a series of art installations and sonic walks that take place in the city over the summer, and that give participants a better understanding of Toronto's relationship to Black enslavement. In one of these walks called Hush Harbor, Turner unsettles the underground narrative by centering the story of Peggy Pompadour. She was an actual enslaved woman who had a habit of running away. She was enslaved by Peter Russell, a politician in the Legislative Assembly and administrator of Upper Canada. In her sonic walk, Camille Turner imagines a love story in which Peggy's repeated attempts to escape slavery and their experiences of Canada's practices of Black dispossession clashed with the desire of her newly arrived lover from the United States, who comes to Canada as a refugee and sees Canada as his horizon of freedom. So what we don't often talk about is this kind of contradiction in Canada's history, that at the same time that 50,000 African Americans were walking north across the border to find freedom in Canada, that Canada still had and held enslaved peoples within its territories who would not be freed until 1833. The elevation of the underground freedom narrative obscures these nuances, obscures and in many ways absolves Canada of its responsibility in slavery, but it also erases other Black presences in Canada. The early 20th century, for example, saw a large movement of Black settlers into the prairies, into Alberta, into Saskatchewan, and into Nova Scotia. And these stories, these presences often go unremarked altogether. Black people are then often excluded from stories of Canada's historical development, with an almost exclusive attention paid to Caribbean and African immigrants arriving after the 1960s. I want to suggest, though, today, I want to remark specifically on the relationships between Canada and those immigrants, of which I am one, who come to this country through the Caribbean. To help us to recognize that for those of us who came to Canada from the formerly British and French Caribbean after the 1960s, we also came out of a history of deeply intersecting and interdependent colonial relationships. So for those of us who were enslaved in these former British colonies, our ancestors were governed by the exact same British laws that governed slavery in Canada, and by the same French laws, the Code Noir, that regulated slavery in French-speaking Canada. Enslaved people were also traded constantly between the Caribbean, Canada, and the United States. The British Empire was an interdependent system of power. And these borders were porous, and enslaved people and Black people moved across these borders constantly. Some of the ships used in the 18th century to transport enslaved Africans to the Caribbean and the United States were actually built in Canada, in Newfoundland, which would later become a part of Canada. Enslaved people in the Caribbean were fed by food produced in Canada. So salt cod was sent from Atlantic Canada to the Caribbean to feed enslaved peoples working on sugar plantations. And that sugar in return was sent back to Canada and used in rum distilleries in Newfoundland. Even after slavery ended, this relationship didn't end. Canadian missionary schools were established. Christian missionary schools were established in the Caribbean, in places like Trinidad, to educate formerly indentured, the children of formerly indentured Indian workers, or even at the time indentured Indian workers, but also to educate poor Black children. And Canada would profit until late in the 20th century from the extraction of natural resources in the Caribbean, and continue to profit in various ways. Canada therefore actively participated in the colonial practices of the Caribbean and benefited from racist and imperialist laws against Caribbean indigenous peoples, against enslaved Africans, and against Indian and Chinese indentured workers. The assumption that later arriving Caribbean immigrants have benefited from, but contributed little to the long-term development of Canada is therefore false. If Canada's history is only partially told or selectively acknowledged, then we must also recognize the role that Black people have played in this country, but also recognize the role that educational institutions have played in obscuring that history, as well as their role in the projects of imperialism and colonialism. Recently, a number of Canadian universities have been publicly acknowledging this role. McGill University, Lisa, can you advance me? Thank you. McGill University recently announced plans to install a plaque next to a statue of James McGill, the university's founder, outlining his involvement with the transatlantic slave trade and his ownership of enslaved peoples. In 2019, a panel tasked with exploring Dalhousie University's history of racism and links to slavery revealed that George Ramsay, or Lord Dalhousie, the man from whom the university derived its name, was also a pro-slavery lobbyist who had made racist remarks about Black refugees from the War of 1812. Queen's University issued an apology recently concerning the decision of its Senate in 1918 to ban Black students from enrolling in its medical school. At the time, around 15 Black men were enrolled, one of the largest cohorts of Black students of any medical school in the country. But because of this ruling, at least half of them were forced out and quit. The medical schools at McGill, Dalhousie, and the University of Toronto also excluded Black students or placed restrictions on their admission until the 1960s. These and other actions have left a profound and powerful impact on Canada's relationship with its Black communities, because they confirmed an intellectual worldview that legitimized the construction of Black people's inhumanity, their exchange as property, and entrenched the historical patterns of anti-Black racism that continue to inform Canadian society. York University is a much younger school whose history begins at the period in which Canada and other universities were beginning to ameliorate some of their racist views. That doesn't, of course, absolve us, right? Because as a knowledge institution and a knowledge space, it's our responsibility to make sure that we are leading the change in societal attitudes. So I am grateful for the support of the dean, the support of the faculty, and the opportunity to share this brief history with you today. I'm going to pause. I hope I did not go over my time, and allow Lisa to continue. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Davis. We indeed have a lot of learning to do as it relates to the history, and really, as it states, the contributions that often go unseen or unregarded. It's really important for us to know that this history has been told to us in a particular way, and that we have an opportunity to learn more about our history. What I wanted to do was share with you and get right into sort of a process, if you will, for concerns and addressing these concerns that are present day, right? So what might be issues or instances of anti-Black racism that are happening on campus, and that you need avenues to address these concerns. So we'll hone in first on the Center for Human Rights, Equity, and Inclusion in our offices, specifically looking at one-on-one concerns or complaints-based processes, and then also pan out. As an institution, we've got various areas or places that you would be able to go to seek out recourse. All right, so the first slide really just then talks about the flow of a complaint process. And I do want to start off by saying that this process isn't always set in stone. Again, it's a general flow. And we don't necessarily put any time frames on them as far as, you know, when you would assume that a complaint would be resolved. It really has to do with the facts of the case or the concern that somebody brings forward and what it is that they're looking for to get out of the concern, right? And to how they might want to address it, all right? So within this procedure, what we do is first establish that the person that's bringing forward has maybe had an instance or an incident that they want to bring forward is a member of the York community, right? Staff, student, faculty. Anyone on the campus related to the campus will be able to access our services. And so we just established that that person is then a member within the York community. And two, we focus on whether or not there is an element of a human rights concern. And we'll speak to what a human rights complaint might be in a bit in the next slide. But specifically that we want to establish that the complaint actually has a human rights element to it. And particularly in this conversation, we might think about the code, the Ontario Human Rights Code, developed in 1962, protecting folks from discrimination on the basis of aspects of their identity. So thinking about race, thinking about color, thinking about ethnic origin, place of origin, also creed. Right? And whether or not there's 17 protected grounds, but I just relate to the ones that were actually sort of fall under a banner of anti-Black racism, because you tend to see concerns that might arise around race that are actually couched in creed concerns, right? Or concerns about color or place of origin. Right? So knowing that these are grounds that are protected under the code in ways, again, you may seek recourse through the Human Rights Code. Okay. Then we established that the concern that has happened, right, the incident has happened within a year. Right? There is a limitation on bringing forward these concerns. So it is that we encourage folks to both document that the concern has happened or when it's happened, right, and what are the facts sort of surrounding the issues. But within the year, we're able to proceed on what might be a formalized complaint. There are some exceptions to this, and this might fall outside. When we have a conversation with somebody who might want to bring a formal complaint, we will be able to see that there can be some exceptions to within the 1 year period. All right. The good faith principle is really just establishing that the complaint isn't frivolous or vexatious, right? But that it's brought in good faith, right? That is, again, a measure that sort of within legal terms will help folks ensure that they have got a case, if you will, right? And making sure that that is actually going to lead them forward to actually look for recourse or a resolution. Right? And in the resolution process, there are different ways in which you can go about seeking recourse, right? All the way, more of an informal process, all the way to a formal investigation. So if you look at steps 5.1 to 5.3, you'll see this. Informal resolutions will be where our case resolution advisors, right, will seek to obtain information and clarify points. Right? So meeting with people around, again, their complaint, and also with a respondent, so an individual who has been named in this complaint, having conversations to clarify again any points of information that they can actually bring to the attention of both parties. Right? Those parties involved may actually come to an agreement. So for example, there may be an agreement for an apology, a letter of apology actually, right? That's written that both parties will then move forward on and agree to. Right? Mediation is where a mediator will actually step in and have a facilitated discussion with the two parties that are involved, and again, work towards an agreed upon resolution. A resolution that once both parties do hold and agree to, that it's binding. A formal investigation is where we would actually explore the facts. Through an investigation process, you may interview the complainant, who might be named as a respondent or somebody on the receiving end of this complaint, any witnesses in and around the situation who can actually speak to or even validate some points, right, or clarify some of the points as well, to really come to a finding. When you make a finding, you're making that based on the evidence that's presented before you. And that's why I always encourage folks that once you have a concern, if it's, I mean, in this context, we're talking about anti-Black racism, and oftentimes we recognize how racism manifests, why we even spoke to microaggressions in our previous session. We know that there are certain subtleties that are expressions potentially of discrimination, but we attempt to establish whether or not those types of subtle forms of discrimination will rise to the level of the level of being discriminatory in nature or potentially harassment, right? Which leads to my next slide. So what is a human rights complaint? It's very important for people to understand, again, that, for example, the scope of our office and the scope of resolution that you may find from our office is on a case-by-case basis. So bringing forward one case with one party who may be a complainant and one or more parties who will be then the respondent, right? As opposed to where there are maybe systemic issues at play. This process through our offices will address one issue that might be at play, okay? So a complaint will focus on either discrimination or harassment. The focus of the concern, discrimination, I would sort of, if I were to define discrimination, it's the denial of equal treatment, right? Where you actually have an opportunity to enable equal treatment, right? That may be what was intended or not, but what is a greater focus will be the impact that it has had on an individual or groups even, right? So for example, where we do our work most is not just focusing on the fact that somebody may not have intended to make a comment that was discriminatory in nature, or, you know, not provide any or access to a program, for example, because they had intended to. We focus on the impact that it has had. Similarly, harassment as a form of discrimination will be a pattern, right, of ongoing unwelcome, if you will, comments, conduct, right, that either is perceived by the individual that is leveling that harassment or not. Again, we're not relying on whether or not they had any kind of intention to do this. Okay? We're focused again on the impact that it has had. So there must be some adverse outcome for the complainant. And when you speak about human rights concerns, you speak about the dignity of people, right? And if they feel as though, you know, their dignity has been lost in a certain circumstance, that will be an adverse outcome for them if you think about the concerns around race. If a comment is made, about, you know, where you're from, you know, your belief systems or your ethnic origin, or what, again, thinking about race specifically. So actually knowing that as a Black person, a comment was made towards me, then you're thinking about the adverse outcome of that comment on you, right? And particularly around the fact that it might be a concern of your dignity, loss of dignity. So the complainant must be a member of a protected group under the Ontario Human Rights Code. And also looking at our York University anti-racism policies, you can actually find that policy on the Secretariat website at York University. It also supports complainant concerns. The idea with the York University policy is that it upholds a commitment to the Ontario Human Rights Code, right? So working together, essentially. And just saying a member of a protected group is that, again, there are 17 grounds of protection based on aspects of your identity. And as I mentioned, race is a covered ground, right? Ethnic origin, place of origin, creed, there are 17, there are maybe 14 more, sorry. But knowing that, again, you will find protection under the code if in fact you have a concern that is grounded in issues of race. Right? There must be an allegation of fact that a prohibited ground was a factor in any of that adverse outcome. Right? So again, going back to this point about the allegation or the comment, the conduct that is leveled towards someone else has to be a violation of any one of those code ground rights. So in that a comment was made particularly about your race. That prohibited ground need not be the sole or primary factor in the adverse outcome. It could be a conversation about something else, but it must be at a minimum, it must have at least been a part of the conversation, right? So again, if it was a comment that you may have been talking about other aspects of your identity, if you want to focus on the issue of race, it might have been because the comment then spoke to a concern about your race. We apply what's called a prima facie case analysis. This would be just a very surface level analysis, right? And that analysis is just saying, assuming that all the facts that somebody brings forward are true, would it actually amount to an infringement of your rights? Would it actually rise to the level of being a discriminatory action or even harassment? And that's the first step in determining what process we would even follow or what action somebody might take, right? And also what outcomes you might actually see. The complainant's sincere belief that a prohibited ground was a factor is not sufficient. We actually encourage folks that are bringing forward information about a concern to provide points of evidence, right? Suggesting that the prohibited ground was indeed a factor. Right? That is a very important piece why I always talk about documentation. Again, documenting not just when something may have occurred, but what the specifics are. Who was there? What the action, if you can remember the comment word for word, or what feelings you had word for word, like everything I would encourage folks to capture as a means of providing evidence or information that's helpful to their case. Now we recognize that coming through our doors is one avenue, right? We do know that as a faculty, there are many different avenues that you might consider accessing. And so we want you to know that it's important that once you do have a concern, that you will have various channels to go through. You can speak to leaders within your department, deans, faculties, faculty members, other supervisors and supports within the managerial teams. If that is actually an area of concern for you, then you know that you might have your union representations that you can go to. You can also speak to the human resources teams, right, about any concerns. And I've just mentioned, you can also access our services as well. So knowing that you have different places to go, you would be able to choose at various times. And also, I want to say that you can go to various ones at the same time too, right? So, for example, you may come to our offices and you might have a concern that you've raised to us, but you might have also raised that same concern within your union, right? So knowing that there are processes that often happen or that are often aligned, or that one process may begin where another one stops to allow the other one to continue, right, is also what's seen across the institution as well, because of the various channels that you can access. But it is really just the messaging to go somewhere, right? To know that you will have a point of concern and that you need to go to wherever you believe is the best place to go to at the time to address those concerns. What I'll also say is that there are protections, protections even under the Ontario Human Rights Code for this concern around reprisal. So reprisal is really this idea that there is some action that's taken against you. It might be action directly, or it might even be in the form of a threat, right, to take action against someone who has actually brought a concern, so brought a human rights complaint forward, or has witnessed an alleged form of discrimination taking place. And those protections from reprisal are basically put in place because we know how challenging it can be for somebody to come forward, right? Come forward and talk about an issue that, had they not talked about it, they might maintain the status quo. They might have been silenced in different instances, and now they're actually raising their voice about a concern. And that might ostracize them, right? That might set them apart from colleagues who didn't want to say anything otherwise, or didn't maybe have the means and so forth. And oftentimes that reprisal, particularly in workplace settings, will again further chip away at the dignity and the concerns that folks have in addressing their matters. So that protection is also in place. You do have to prove in these instances that somebody actually intended to reprise you on the basis of the claim that you put forward. And if folks have questions, feel free, you can throw them in the chat. We'll have an opportunity at the end also to discuss this further. What we'll do now, as we try to create enough room for these breakout sessions, we're at 9:36.
Lisa, sorry.
Yes.
Because we are at 9:36, and I know people are really want to spend time talking together, may I suggest that we only do the first breakout scenario so that we have more time together rather than trying to rush through two and maybe not doing them well enough?
Sure. Alternatively, we could suggest if we have two scenarios, the odd or the even and odd could actually take on scenario 1 and scenario 2. So we could have the even groups that go into their breakouts take on scenario 1, and the odd groups take on scenario 2. We can do it that way, or if we want to just do 1.
Okay, what do people want? Can you just put, why don't we do that then? Odd numbers do scenario 1, even numbers, whatever you decide. Okay.
Just because we do have an opportunity, we can take that to ensure that we get through, but we want maybe people's eyes on both, and then we'll be able to come back to the larger group. How does that sound for folks? So did I say it wrong? Okay, so with anyone who goes into an odd number group, you'll take on scenario 1. Anyone who goes into an even numbered group will take on scenario 2. And just as you're entering the breakout rooms, you'll actually be able to see what number room you're in.
Lisa, could I suggest the scenarios are placed in the chat room?
Yes.
In the breakout room or on the chat?
Okay, so what I'll do, I'm just going to stop this just for a minute, and I will place them both in the chat now and then read them out for everyone. So the first scenario, a colleague has documented concerns about microaggressions that take place in the office by colleagues, including their supervisor and a faculty member, and comes to you for support. The questions that we're asking you to answer in that question, or in that scenario, sorry, are what are some of the actions that you could take to provide support to them? And what factors, let's put that in the chat. What factors would you consider, or should they consider, in addressing their concerns and seeking recourse? And scenario number 2. So this scenario, you are participating in the hiring process where a concern about an aspect of an applicant's identity is brought forward by a member of the panel that seems to be based on race. Other panel members are puzzled and not sure what they are really trying to say and what it means to the interview process. So put that in the chat. And then the questions that we would have for you would be, how would you address this issue and where would you start? And the second question is, what concerns do you have, if any, about this interaction and dynamic? So as you go into your breakout sessions, you'll be able to see all of this information in the chat.